Since the War of 1812, the United States has had some level of security around the White House, taking many forms over the next 110 years, ranging from night watchmen, militia, personal bodyguards, and even plainclothed guards who doubled as tour guides during the day. It wasn't until 1922 did a full-time permanent force form charged with guarding the grounds specifically. Known as the White House Police Force, over the next few decades, members would see their uniforms change from time to time, but they would always be comparable with ones worn by other police departments of the era. That is, until President Nixon took office, introducing perhaps one of the most controversial and mocked uniforms in the entire history of the United States. January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon is sworn in as the 37th President of the United States. In another 2.5 years, Deep Throat would secretly meet with reporter Bob Woodward, effectively kicking off the Watergate scandal, one of the largest and arguably most famous controversies to plague the highest office of the land. Even though many people today know of this scandal, Nixon's association with it, along with his famous line,
"Well, I'm not a crook,"
there was a much smaller scale controversy associated with Nixon that has sort of been lost in time to an extent. Seen early in his term, it involved a rather strange move to change the uniforms of the White House Police Force, a branch of the Secret Service tasked with guarding the White House and Executive Office building, to ones that many consider to be flashy and unorthodox. The story starts during President Nixon's 8-day trip to Europe, specifically Belgium, the United Kingdom, West Germany, Italy, France, and the Vatican, as a way to try and bolster the resolve and update the policies of NATO, which was entering its 20th year, as well as try and promote peace between the West and the Soviet Union through a cooling of the arms race. During his trip, naturally, Nixon met with numerous politicians, heads of state, and other government officials, and as such found himself at various government sites and buildings, many of which had some level of security, often wearing unique and sometimes eye-catching uniforms. Liking the looks, once he returned home, he began the process of creating a new uniform, and in just under a year's time, that being January of 1970, they were unveiled. This is, however, the supposed story, but there is another factor: the designer of the uniforms, Jimmy Muscatello, who claimed that the idea was all his. But before we get into all that, let's take a quick look at these uniforms, as elements of them are relatively practical, while others are a bit strange, at least in the context they were presented. Starting at the top, a black leather with gold-trimmed short Shako-style cap reminiscent of ones worn by German police was seen. Being a popular piece in many areas of Europe through the 1800s, numerous police forces within Germany continued to use them well after World War II and through much of the Cold War, and as such were undoubtedly seen by Nixon during his trip to West Germany. Later on, a more traditional white with gold trim and black visor peaked cap was also used. Both hats boasted the White House police emblem upon their front. Moving down to the tunic, which was perhaps the most eye-catching element, as it was of double-breasted design featuring numerous gold buttons around the flap. The second from the top on the wearer's left was omitted to allow for the wearing of an officer's badge, as well as a Mandarin-style collar seeing WH, short for White House, pins on each end, shoulder tabs, and a gold agulette around the wearer's right arm. Around the tunics were black belts featuring a gold buckle depicting the police emblem, and a matching black flapped leather pistol holster. Finally, to offset all the white were black trousers bearing a gold stripe along the length of each leg. Now, this design wasn't the original one, as Muscatello, a Washington, D.C.-based tailor since 1945, who was also responsible for most of the more traditional suits and other uniforms of the Secret Service, when interviewed stated that he had approached them and the White House about creating new red uniforms closer in style to that of the then Queen's Guard. Never setting foot in Europe, much of his inspiration and references came from viewing photos of ceremonial and formal uniforms seen in books and other print media. Muscatello took the concept to, quote, "the man in charge of police there, and he looked at me real funny, but I made up a sample anyway and took it back up there to the White House." However, after numerous meetings and much discussion and input, his red concept was rejected as it was considered too flamboyant. But he still was approved to create 150 new uniforms, which eventually resulted in the final white ones costing just over $100 each. Now, it's important to note that these uniforms weren't intended to replace the everyday wear of police stationed at the White House, but were rather worn for special occasions and ceremonies, such as to greet visiting dignitaries and other VIPs. In fact, they were first unveiled to the public this way on January 27th when British Prime Minister Harold Wilson visited. It was here that after the greeting ceremony and formalities had concluded, the new uniforms were taken off and replaced with the standard ones usually worn by officers. So how did the public respond to the historic unveiling? Not that great. Over the next few days, fashion designers and news outlets alike around the country reported and commented, with most leaning towards the more critical. Some words and phrases were dazzling operetta-like, a bit showy. Even ushers at old-time movie palaces were garbed with greater restraint and better taste. They look pompous 19th century rather than functional 20th century. Falls somewhere between early high school band and late palace guard, like generals in the banana republics to the south of us. And the uniforms were a little hard, a little Prussian, a little stormtrooper. I don't think they're appropriate. You get the idea. At best, they were seen as just sort of okay or a bit too European. At worst, more befitting a dictatorship or based around uniforms of the Third Reich. However, this was all from a general standpoint and viewing the uniforms as a whole. Some were a bit more specific, pointing out that they seemed very impractical and out of date, citing things like the flapped holsters, which were something more commonly seen in the early decades of the 20th century. This criticism wasn't only typed, as political cartoons and illustrations depicting the uniforms were seen in the weeks after, with one even being drawn and gifted to President Nixon by cartoonist Eugene Bassett, signed, "To Dick Nixon. Best wishes for a long reign." Whether it was the criticism in the media or the uniforms themselves, within a month's time, wearers began to express their disdain due not only to the overall appearance but also the hat's uncomfortable design. And so those were removed and replaced with more recognizable and familiar white peak caps. However, the uniforms continued to be worn, usually to greet visiting heads of state and other dignitaries, until as late as April 1973, where they were seen as a part of the welcoming ceremony for Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. However, it's a safe assumption that they as a whole remained in use to some official capacity until Nixon's resignation, which came on August 9, 1974. So what happened to them after? Well, until 1980 they were simply mothballed in some government storage location until it was decided by the General Services Administration a majority of them would be auctioned off. Of the 150 or so uniforms, 132 of them were put up on the auction block, and this is where this strange story gets even stranger, as around 32 were bought by the Iowa Surplus Property Division, and in turn were bought by the Meriden Cleghorn High School for its marching band. Costing only a few dollars apiece, they were publicly unveiled on the evening of October 31st, 1980, Halloween, by parading through part of the town leading up to a football game. Granted, the uniforms were altered slightly, seeing White House police symbols replaced with school ones. At this point, you'd think the story would be over. Nope. In fact, it gets even stranger, as before the school got their hands on them, rock star Alice Cooper had actually found out about the Iowa Surplus Division winning many from the federal auction and asked if he could buy them to equip his road crew while on tour. However, because they were bought and owned by a state entity, they could only go to public agencies such as hospitals, schools, and things of that nature. So instead, he flew out the school's superintendent, 2 recent graduates, and 2 uniforms to Los Angeles, California to attend one of his shows and to, of course, see the pieces in person. Today, most of the original uniforms have been lost to time, though a few pieces are still preserved in museums and other institutions, such as the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. To those wondering if they can get their hands on one, it's unlikely but not impossible. As recently as 2020, a partial one came up for auction online. However, it seems it didn't sell for whatever reason. This likely means that there may still be a few floating around out there, so keep your eyes out. As for the White House Police Force, it became the Executive Protection Service in 1970 and eventually the United States Secret Service Uniform Division, or USSSUD, in 1977, which remains its name to this day. As for the uniforms, they are equipped and adorned with ones much more practical and in line with ones worn by similar units. That includes their more formal attire too. At the end of the day, these uniforms had a very short official shelf life, but proved to have a very wild, musical, and useful afterlife. But whatever you may think about them, they have certainly proved to be one of the most memorable, forgettable uniforms in United States history. Ones that were associated with a very divisive president who himself became involved in a much larger scandal that quickly overshadowed them and ultimately led to the end of his political career. But hopefully this video was fun and interesting to those who viewed it. If you enjoyed it, perhaps leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. If not, no worries. Just be sure to check back real soon for more of the history of right here on Uniform History.